right, this is another problem where we've got units to a power that we're going to be converting, and this is also another one where we have kind of a fairly long set of conversions that need to take place here. So I'm going to think about my roadmap as I usually do, where I'm recognizing here that the number I'm starting with has units of miles squared or square miles, and that the units that I want to end up with are square kilometers or kilometers squared. So if I'm starting with miles squared and I want to end up with kilometers squared, what do I need to do to get through those units based off of what I'm being given in the problem or what I have at the top of the page here? So if I come up here for my length conversions, I remember that I've got two conversions up top here that deal with length. The first one is the centimeters to inches conversion, which is super useful because this takes the metric system and relates it to the English system. And if we notice in this problem, that's exactly the situation we're dealing with, because miles is going to be an English system of units, whereas kilometers is a metric system of units. So we're going to need this conversion factor because that gets us from one unit system to the other. And the one other conversion up top here that may be useful, because I don't expect everybody to have this memorized, and that is that 1 mile is equal to 1,760 yards. And so in terms of our English system, notice that this conversion between metric to English is going to land us in the centimeters unit, and it means we're going to need inches before we go to centimeters. So if I'm starting with miles, I need a way to get to inches. And if I've got miles related to yards, that means I need to get from yards to inches. So my first step here is going to be miles squared to yards squared, because I have this conversion that relates miles and yards given to me. And then I want to get to inches squared so that I can use the centimeters to inches conversion factor. So yards squared, most of you should be able to feel comfortable getting to feet squared from yards. So you should probably know how many feet are in a yard. Most of you should feel comfortable getting from feet into inches, because you should know how many inches are in a foot. So inches squared, once we get there, then we know the relationship between inches and centimeters. So from inches squared, we're going to end up with centimeters squared. And to get from centimeters squared to kilometers squared, notice that those are in the same unit system, right? They're both centimeters and kilometers both have the base unit meter. They just have different prefixes. And you know that my favorite way to do this is to always go through the base unit. So I'm going to go from centimeters squared to meters squared. And then from there, I can finally get into kilometers squared. So that is going to be my roadmap for this problem. And so what is this going to look like? Well, we're going to start with the 191 miles squared. And I'm going to do what I usually do here, which is I'm going to write out all of the units where they should be and then deal with the numbers at the end. So each one of these arrows in my roadmap represents a conversion factor that I'm going to need. So I've got how many arrows? I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 arrows. So I need 6 sets of conversion factors that I'm going to use here. And for my units, I'm going through and I'm paying attention to what I'm converting into. So miles needs to cancel out. So I have miles on the bottom and I need to end up with yards on the top. Yards needs to then cancel out and I need to end up with feet on the top. Then feet is going to cancel out and I'm going to end up with inches on the top. And then inches is going to cancel out and I'm going to end up with centimeters on the top. And then centimeters is going to cancel out and I'm going to end up with meters on the top. And finally, meters cancels out and I end up with kilometers on the top. Notice how easy that is to just kind of pay attention to the units first and go through and make sure that you've got them all set up properly. Now, you may have noticed that one of the things I ignored here is the squares, because notice right now the way I have this written, the units are not actually going to cancel. Think about exponents. You may remember exponent rules where, like, if you have x squared over x, you know that this simplifies to just x, because the 1 that we can't see on this x in the denominator here, when we combine together something where we have the same variable but we just have different powers for these variables. When we combine them here, we subtract them. So 2 minus 1 leaves us with a 1, and that's why we end up with x. Another example of this would be like x to the 4th over x cubed. You would end up with x to the, whoops, that's not the example I wanted to give you guys. Let me do something a little different because that gives me the same answer. X to the 4th over x squared. Let's look at that one. The 4 minus 2 is going to leave us with a 2, so we would end up with x squared here. Another example of this, let me do the flipped version. X squared over x to the 4th. Well, 2 minus 4 gets us a negative 2. That's actually the same thing as 1 over x squared. So again, this is not an algebra class, but we have to use a lot of algebra rules. And I always start off class by telling everybody, make sure your algebra skills are strong. And if they are not, you want to go back and brush up on these techniques, because it really is something you have to kind of intuitively understand mathematically when we're applying these things to higher level concepts. So what that all means is, these powers on the units basically can be treated the same way as exponents on variables in algebra. So right now, I'm not going to actually cancel out miles squared because I've only got miles on the bottom. So yes, the miles on the bottom cancels out, but really the way this is set up, you're only going to cancel out the squared. You're still going to be left with miles, and that's not good because we want to get rid of all of that unit, right? The whole thing, miles squared. So the way we deal with this is to make sure that we square our conversion factors. So going across all of these conversion factors here, we need to put a square on the outside of the parentheses. And what that does is it squares everything on the inside of the parentheses. It squares the units and it squares the numbers that are in there. And so when we go to calculate this at the end, I will kind of reiterate this again, how you're going to punch it into your calculator, because there's a lot of squares we have to deal with here. The other thing I will point out is that an alternative way to do this, although it would be so much longer that I wouldn't be able to put the whole thing on the screen, would be to not square, but just use the conversion factor twice. So if you notice here, if I want to cancel out that miles squared and I want to end up with yards squared, notice that doing the conversion factor between yards and miles twice will have 2 miles on the bottom, which is going to equal miles squared when you multiply them together, that are going to cancel out with the miles squared there. And then 2 yards on the top, which when multiplied together are going to give yards squared, so that I would end up with the unit of yards squared that I'm hoping to convert to with this first step. So this is an alternative way to do the dimensional analysis when you have units to a power, is you can just write out the conversion factors, the number of times that you need them in order to cancel out the units. And so I'm taking this squared value on the miles and I'm recognizing that that means I need to use that conversion factor twice. And that is the same thing, right? Multiplying the unit factor twice, if I get rid of some of this here, if I have yards per miles times yards per miles, that's the same thing as saying that you have this unit conversion factor squared, right? So those represent the exact same thing. Okay, but going back to this problem, all we need to do here, like I said, is fill in the numbers and then actually punch it into our calculator. And so miles to yards, remember this was the one that we were given at the top up here. So there's 1 mile for every 1,760 yards. So I put 1,760 yards, the number stays with the unit, over 1 mile. Feet to yards, you should hopefully know that there are 3 feet in every 1 yard. That should be something you have memorized. Inches and feet, we've got 12 inches in every 1 foot. Again, another one you should have memorized. Centimeters to inches, or inches to centimeters, that one we grabbed from up top here. There's 2.54 centimeters for every 1 inch. So we keep the number with the unit. Going from centimeters to meters, you would use your prefix table if you want to. So you know centi is equal to 10 to the negative 2. So you could do 1 times 10 to the negative 2 meters equals 1 centimeter. Or a lot of you probably already have memorized that there's 100 centimeters per meter, and that's the one I kind of prefer to use for that conversion factor. For kilometers and meters, again, this is another one you may have memorized. Some of you may know that 1 kilometer is equal to 1,000 meters, but let's also note that 1,000 is just 1 times 10 to the third, so that actually is a direct representation of the way I usually use the prefixes, where I swap out kilo with what it means, which is 10 to the third. Okay, so now that we have all the numbers plugged in, how do we punch this in our calculator? Well, I'm going to start with 191, and I'm not squaring the 191 because up here the square is only in the units, so that number is taken as is. So don't be confused here and think that you need to also start off by squaring 191. That 191 is associated with miles squared. We don't need to do anything extra to it. So 191, I'm going to multiply that by 1,760 squared. And so yes, you could do 1,760 squared in your calculator first and then multiply it by 191 if you feel more comfortable doing it that way because you're worried about order of operations. But I will promise you that you can go straight across here, and in your calculator you can type this in all as one line, and order of operations will still work out because exponents are usually handled before multiplication. So if you do 191 times 1,760 squared times 3 squared times 12 squared times 2.54 squared divided by 100 squared and then divided by 1,000 squared, right? And if you type it in that way, all of those squares will take place before any of the multiplication and division steps, and you will get the right answer. So if you type that all in, you get a final value of 494.6877 kilometers squared. And when we look at Sig Figs here, we can note that most of these conversions, again, are infinite number of Sig Figs. So in the same unit system, these last two conversion factors, they have infinite Sig Figs, so they don't affect the value. 12 inches to 1 foot and 3 feet to 1 yard, those also are within the same unit system. They're in the English unit system for length, so they have infinite number of Sig Figs, so they don't affect it. 2.54 and 1 inch is a special conversion factor that we take to be exact numbers. So 1 inch is exactly 2.54 centimeters. So again, they have infinite Sig Figs. And kind of a similar thing going on here with the yards and miles. You could say that these are exact numbers because these are within the same unit system. Again, it's the English unit system for length. So they have infinite Sig Figs. So nothing in our conversion factors is limiting our Sig Figs. So we're going based off of our original value of 191, which had 3 Sig Figs, which means our final answer should have 3 Sig Figs. So for the final answer, I'm going to report this as 495 because the 6 next to the last Sig Fig is it's greater than 5, or it's 5 or greater. And so that is going to round up the 4 to a 5. And so 495 kilometers squared.